Hello, Brian Pearce with the Pearce Brothers, and today we're going to be discussing why the single action revolver is still relevant today. Very important gun. A lot of people thought that it was dead when Colt discontinued it back in 1940, the single action army, of course. But today it's very much alive and well. We have some remarkable handguns, single actions that are very, very cutting edge, if you will. Let's talk about that though. But before we get too far, let's back up a minute. I'm going to take the oldest gun on the table, which is a Colt single action army, made in 1875. 45 Colt, of course, 7.5-inch barrel, one-piece walnut stocks. Pretty standard gun of that era. It's this gun's been shot incredible amount, of course, throughout the black powder era. Everything on this gun still works. Now, the actual design dated clear back to the 1830s, but of course we know that Colt modernized it a bit with, when they went from the cap and ball guns to the single action army, which was designed in 1872. One thing you might notice on this gun, it only has 2 patent dates on it here because it didn't, see if we can get those on camera. Because it's early enough, the 3rd patent date had not been manufactured or had been applied yet. So, interestingly, the military adopted this, and I mean, like immediately, they were thrilled with the gun, with the cartridge, the power, the accuracy. In fact, the military managed to get 3-inch groups at 100 yards with these guns. Pretty impressive. They would actually take these guns and shoot them at long range, even out to 500 yards. And test them for accuracy and see if they could teach the soldiers to lay their horses down and shoot in the event that they got pinned down without a rifle or something. But a couple of the virtues of single action: one, it was a very simple gun. In fact, the military paid $13 for these guns, and they were issued with it a screwdriver. This being an original screwdriver. That with that screwdriver right there alone, the whole gun could be taken apart, cleaned, repaired, whatever had to happen. So one reason I took this apart, I wanted to show how the base pin extends all the way through the frame from front to rear. There's no locking mechanism. The cylinder just rotates off that single base pin, and it's a very rugged system. There's nothing to get out of alignment on a crane to break. I mean, it's a rugged gun. These guns took such incredible abuse on the frontier. It's unbelievable. I've seen guns. I've rebuilt many Colts, hundreds of Colts, literally, and I've seen them so severely abused you'd think they could not be resurrected, but with some basic parts and rebuilding, they were good to go again. Of course, the early guns had this set screw here that I won't take time to put that in, but that, of course, retained the base pin. Very positive system. I actually didn't like it when they went to the cross pin system, which that occurred in 1896, but that's another story. So the Colt was a very proven gun. It kind of had a little bit of a reputation for breaking parts, but I want to explain on that a little bit. The early guns had extremely heavy mainsprings in them, and they would, if somebody didn't know what they were doing, or if they were fast drawn or whatever, and they'd let that hammer slip and hit the notches, it could break the trigger sear, the tip of it, or the hammer notch. The other problem was spring steel at that time is nowhere near the quality that we have today. Today we have much better quality spring steel. So the primary springs that broke in these, rarely the mainspring broke, but the mainspring is very heavy. Again, they had inside benet priming on the early ammo, so you look at them from the back and they look like a .22 rimfire, meaning there was no exposed primer, even though the primer was there in the center of the cartridge. It was inside the case. So they needed a super heavy mainspring to reliably ignite those cartridges. So but the main springs that break on these and the early guns was, of course, the trigger and bolt spring and the hand spring. Again, modern springs in a modern revolver, they really don't break. I've got guns that I've literally got 20,000 plus rounds through them, never broke a spring. And I tune them. They have to be tuned correctly. But so I'll show one other gun briefly that's of interest. Of course, the The gunfighter single action was typically referred to as the 4 3/4 inch. This gun, I jokingly call it my Bat Masterson gun. Bat Masterson was famous for ordering a 4 3/4 inch nickel single action Army 45 with gutta percha stocks. So I had the Eagle. They were narrow. They were I actually very much like the narrow grip, which you don't get on modern Colts. He ordered a special height front sight. It's a very famous letter that he wrote to Colt ordering this gun, or one exactly like this, and this is from exactly the same era as Bat Masterson's. This gun, actually, both these guns I've just showed, I've shot. They actually shoot very well. I generally switch to a modern smokeless cylinder when I shoot them, so I don't have to use black powder loads. Swap out the cylinder, and away you go. So going into more modern times, the Colt became a smokeless powder gun. We know that as better stills became available by 1900, and Colt began warranting their guns for smokeless powder. By 1905, they began heat treating the cylinders for higher pressure loads. There was other engineering changes that took place, but the frontier was still strong. The most number of Colts sold to the civilian market in a single period was 1906, 1907. It's kind of interesting. But Colt at that time, you could actually order anything you wanted in finish, engraving. Many famous characters have carried Colt single actions. This is a replica of the original Sears gun. This is a replica of George Patton's gun, actually shipped within just a couple of days from when his was shipped. 4 3/4 45 again. This is a reproduction of the Bob Meldrum gun. This gun is a very famous gun in that Bob Meldrum kind of was one of these guys that was on both sides of the law, and he spent some time in jail for shooting people, but it was a beautifully, this particular gun, the original of this gun I should say, was given to him by a mine that he had cleaned up some of the problems with a mine in Colorado, but that's a whole nother story itself. The reason I point this out is it shows some of the quality engraving that Colt could do at the time. But as we came into a more modern era, we found that there was a very significant gun that was created, actually a series of them, this being a reproduction of Elmer Keith's famous number 5, which he created in the 1920s. He had custom built. Sedgley was the primary builder of that gun, and it was a remarkable gun in that Elmer Keith was taking smokeless powder loads, and he was pushing them to about 1,200 feet per second with his 250 grain bullet. And this was a very historically significant gun. If you haven't ever read the book Six Guns, you really should, because it's readily available. But you can see the trick base pin he did to keep it from jumping base pin during cold weather. Also, he wanted to be able to pull that out with gloves on. So this one was 44 Special, and he was Keith was a guide, an outfitter, a hunter, a gun writer as well. Obviously, there's very few gun writers that you can refer to their first name and everybody knows exactly who you're talking about. And he was very famous character. So this kind of escorted us into the modern time. Now 20 years later, after Keith had developed that gun, Bill Ruger, he developed the Ruger Single 6. He knew there was a demand for a modern single action, and this being a flat top 44 Magnum, 7.5 inch barrel, very rare gun. But he initially introduced the Single 6 in 22, followed by the 357 flat top Blackhawk, and then ultimately the 44 Magnum just a couple years after that. And these were tremendous guns. They featured coil mainspring, coil handspring, coil bolt spring and trigger springs. You can see actually the plunger to this trigger spring right there. Ultra reliable guns, and again, they still retained all the features of the original Colts in that the base pin goes all the way through the frame. There's virtually nothing to knock out of alignment. I mean, you have to bend the entire gun to hurt them. And I mean, these guns can take abuse beyond belief, and that's one of the reasons the single action is still relevant. But it also, part of the reason that's discussed is that the accuracy becomes paramount with these. So because of that rigid locking system and the rigid solid frame, they hold cylinders in alignment. And Bill Ruger modernized. He eventually, by 1973, he developed what was known as the new model single action, because there was some safety issues with the old model, and we're going to actually do a video on this, so please stay tuned with us. But a lot of guys had either not put the safety notch on, or when they did put the so-called safety notch on, it doesn't take that hard of a blow to break the tip of this trigger or the hammer notch, and bingo, it fires. And we will do some testing, live testing with live ammunition, to show why we don't carry the single action with 6 rounds. But Bill was struggling getting that message to people. So he developed in 1973 the new model, which this is not a 1973 model. This is much later, but it basically opened the loading gate, and it drops the bolt, and the cylinder becomes free. And they're easily identifiable, because this has 2 pins, this has 3 screws. So the old model was done away with at that point, which is tragic, because I'm actually very fond of old models. In the mid-1980s, influenced by Elmer Keith's number 5 design, once again, they set out and designed what's known as the Bisley grip frame. This is significant because with trends to go to heavier and heavier loads, more and more recoil, the old single action Army pattern grip frame becomes a little bit, it lacks a little. It was really never designed for that level of recoil. So now we have a modern grip frame that is extremely comfortable. Now, I threw a couple of double actions on here to kind of show something. One of the most common things is, here we have a Ruger Red Hawk 44 mag. Here we have a Ruger Bisley new model Black Hawk. And when you fire this gun, of course, your whole hand generally will stay on that grip frame. And there's nothing to bite you here with really, really heavy recoil. Whereas a double action, like this Red Hawk, it will come back and hit in the web of that hand. And so with continuous firing, these tend to beat people up if you shoot high volume. Smith & Wesson struggled with it as well. Here's a pre-model 29. Same thing, that hump. Now there's stocks that can fill that in, fill the hump in and so forth, but they become a little bit cumbersome sometimes, larger stocks than are necessary. But again, double actions don't lock up as solid as this typical single actions. Now, there are exceptions to that, and Smith & Wesson is now offering a crane lock in some of their double actions. Of course, Ruger and their Red Hawk and their GP100, they've had a lock in the crane. All that's helped, but it still is not the simple, rugged system of the single action. Now, I don't know much about the 1930s cars, but I guess that roadsters and classic cars that era, they tell me, are timeless. Okay, so I heard Bill Ruger once compare that to compare the single action of the cars. It's timeless. It still works. It still functions. It still does its job exactly as it's supposed to. We have modern autos that shoot faster, hold more rounds, all the stuff. But you know, sometimes just pulling a single action and shooting something with one shot is all you're trying to do. So in the post-war era, of course, there was other guns. Uberti was one of the early people that began offering single actions. They were copies of the Colt to a large degree. This particular gun is just a 4 3/4 45. There were some minor engineering changes, but they basically are still copies of the Colt. Here's another one that's stainless steel. These have served extremely well with cowboy action shooters, reenactors, and whatever, and even people that just want a modestly priced single action that works. USFA is a real class act. I did a lot of work for them and consulting and destruction testing of their guns way back, and these are commanding a premium. Beautifully made guns, 100% made in USA after 2000. Unfortunately, Doug Donnelly, the owner, didn't go bankrupt, just decided that he wanted to do other things. So that's kind of the story there. Now, I got to mention a couple of others before we leave the Colt single action pattern guns. Is that Colt in 1960, technically 61, but really production began in 62, started with the New Frontier series. Wonderful guns. They, of course, were just a modern recreation of the 1880s Colt single action Army flat top, but they had a fully adjustable rear sight. This is actually a pretty rare barrel length, 4 3/4, 45 in the second generation series. I think they made 81 of them. I had Paul Persinger make me some ivory stocks with my favorite horse on the carved on there. So, but these guns are shooters. Now we're gonna take this a little further. Ruger, of course, I didn't bring them, but they built the Blackhawk, new model Blackhawk, I should say, in 357 Maximum years ago. There was some problems with the cutting of the top strap in those guns, but then beginning again, here several years ago, they offered the Blackhawk again in 454 Casull and in 480 Ruger, and I understand those are out of production now. Hopefully that we'll see them come back at some point. But meanwhile, we're going to talk a little bit about the Freedom Arms Medal 83, and I'll do a full-length video on these at some point. These guns, this particular one's chambered in 475 Linebaugh. This lower gun is 454 Casull. They are remarkable guns. They are actually the only gun in the world that is line bored. Now, what I mean by line board is that when, and custom gunsmiths will do this as well, to a custom built gun, but basically when a gun is built, a production gun, let's just say like this Ruger, okay, so they have, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 cylinders made over there. They have a bunch of frames made over here. They basically marry everything together. They make sure that the gun ranges, so in other words, each chamber lines well enough to be, that you're not spitting lead and powder out the side and so forth. Make sure it ranges with the bore. And I got to emphasize, our modern companies do remarkable with producing guns at the price they do. I know everything in recent years has really escalated. I mean, everything has, and we complain about the guns because it wasn't that many years ago that we could buy the same gun we buy today for $1,000 that, just a few years back you could buy it for $500. I understand, but it's not just guns. But they have to pay huge insurance premiums. They are taxed to death by our government, and for them to be able to make these guns and get them out the door is remarkable. I had to get that comment in. So, but that's normal. So they fit these barrels and cylinders and frames all together, and they're really, really great guns for the money. But for the guy that is discriminating and wants something better, what's unique about the Freedom Arms is that the cylinders lock, like as in you literally cannot feel any movement on that gun. No cylinder end shake, no side play. They lock them solid. But what they do is they take an unbored cylinder and they will bore it from, it'll usually have a pilot hole, but they'll bore without the barrel in. They have a special fixture that goes in the frame, and they create a center hole in each chamber. So each chamber is lined up with the axis of the threads of the frame, or what in a rifle you'd call a receiver ring. So at that point they take the cylinder and then they chamber it from the breech end properly, because a chamber has, for a revolver cartridge, has a step down to the throat. So you can't do the complete chamber from the front. It has to be finished at the back, and of course high polished and all that. But what that assures is that every chamber is dead nut centered with the axis of the bore. It results in extreme accuracy. It makes the guns last longer. There's less shock to the cylinder from side to side and so forth. Anyway, they're remarkable guns. Again, this is a single action that is designed to take incredibly high pressures. In 454, I won't even say how much I've seen those guns take pressures in experimenting, but it's way over 100,000 psi. Most rifles, bolt action rifles, will have their lugs, their locking lugs sheared off by the point, and yet those guns don't move. They're that solid. Of course, they use 17.4 pH stainless. Their cylinders, I don't know if they still are doing this, but they're double heat treated at one point. And I assume they are, maybe they've changed stills a little bit. I'm not positive on that, so I won't say. But again, you have that solid base pin that runs through the frame. The cylinder runs off that solid base pin, and there's just nothing. I mean, man, it makes the single action an incredibly durable, strong gun. Now, I gotta to further illustrate what I'm talking about, this gun I bought brand new, special ordered it in the 1980s. Actually, won't get into the story, but it became an experimental gun a little bit with the factory, and has my initials on the serial as the serial number. It's got hand scrimshod grips, stocks, I should say, with patterns of my design, an actual story behind this bear story, and that was represented the largest elk I ever shot. So with this gun, I've actually taken elk, I've taken black bear, mule deer, a lot of other stuff with it, coyotes, rattlesnakes, badgers, you name it, they've been shot with this gun. This gun's had well in excess of 10,000 rounds through it. Well in excess, I emphasize that, and there was virtually no light loads, and it's still rock solid. It still just runs like a Swiss watch, and I've seen double actions in 454 either blow up or come apart with some of the loads that have been fired in this gun. So it's there you have it, single actions. They're still very, very relevant. Now, one last thing, we'll kind of finish on an odd note here. And this kind of has nothing to do with anything except that the single actions are kind of American. They're unique to America. Americans have built revolvers like nobody else in the world. Our handguns are the most sought after, most desirable. The Colt single action of all these, I mean, we have some handsome guns here, but generally speaking, the Colt single action is the most artistic, most beautifully laid out revolver. So even though it was designed as a military gun originally, it has lended itself to the finest ornamentation, engraving that you can possibly do. These are just a few examples. Here's a couple of pre-war Colts that I rebuilt here several years ago, and these are unique in that they carry many of our old family cattle brands or neighbors' cattle brands. We were friends with the people at the Wine Cup Ranch. There's a cattle brand there, the Pitchfork, the Sunrise, a variety of them. This also has my our family brands. There's my grandfather's brand on this. There's the Hash Knife outfit, which reason I put that on there, they were a famous outfit down in Arizona. My grandfather was friends with them and trained with them before he became an Arizona Ranger. There's Flying V, which is my father's brand. The Broken Circle and Doe Gun Sight, which are our brands out at our old Huntington, Oregon ranch, which was on the old Oregon Trail. So I had these guns kind of built as kind of a personal nature, but of course one-piece ivory stocks and so forth. And these guns lend themselves to absolute beauty, and yes, I actually shoot every gun on this table. So there you have it, the single action. There's nothing quite like one. They're remarkable in their own right. They're just as modern day as they ever were, just as useful. I probably use them more than any other gun. So I carry them daily, regular. They've always served me well. They're extremely accurate. I mentioned accuracy with the Freedom Arms guns and that, but with proper load development and so forth, these guns are capable of minute of angle accuracy. Yeah, I'm not exaggerating. Minute of angle. You can, many times people scope them up. I've even done it with a Model 97. Developed some cast bolt loads, did a lot of load experimenting, and literally 1-inch groups at 100 yards. And that's the type of accuracy you get out of a single action, or they have the potential to. Even going back to this 1875 era gun, I dare show me a modern striker fired pistol, and I'm not picking on them, that can outshoot these. They can't. The internal dimensions of these guns were remarkable. They were remarkable shooters. So the single action is still a very relevant gun. Very rugged, very reliable. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope to see you next time on the Pearce Brothers.